She would remember for the rest of her life that the man who changed everything smelled like rain and cheap coffee, and that she almost didn't look up at all. It was 11 at night in a diner that never quite got warm no matter how high the heater ran, and Elena Marsh was counting the register with fingers that had gone numb an hour ago. The bell over the door rang. A man walked in wearing a coat too thin for the weather, his jaw dark with 3 days of stubble, his eyes the kind of tired that made people look away rather than ask questions. He ordered black coffee and nothing else, and when he reached into his pocket, he came up short. $4 and change for a $5 tab. He apologized without meeting her eyes, already turning to leave the coffee untouched on the counter, already bracing for the small, familiar humiliation of not having enough. Elena reached into her apron and set a $1 bill on the counter between them. "It's on me," she said. "Sit down before it gets cold." He looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has not seen in a very long time. Not with hunger, not with suspicion, but with a kind of stunned disbelief that kindness could still exist without a price tag attached to it. He didn't say much. He drank his coffee slowly, like he was in no hurry to return to wherever he'd come from, and when he left the dollar bill folded neatly beneath the empty mug. She didn't think about him again. Not until 3 days later, when the diner she had worked in for 6 years was bought out from under her by a company she'd never heard of, and the new owner walked in wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and she realized, with her stomach dropping through the floor, that she was looking at the same face. Before we go deeper into this story, if you enjoy dark tales of power, obsession, and secrets that refuse to stay buried, hit that like button and subscribe to the Mafia boss stories. And tell me in the comments, if a stranger you'd shown one small act of kindness to turned out to hold your entire future in his hands, would you run, or would you stay to find out why he came back? His name was Damien Voss, and by the time Elena learned it, half the city already knew it and feared it in equal measure. He ran Voss Maritime, a shipping empire that moved cargo through 3 continents, though the people who worked closest to him knew that the legitimate manifests were only the visible surface of something far deeper and far more dangerous underneath. He was 34 years old, and he had built his authority the way other men built houses, brick by brick, with his own hands, with no one to inherit and no one to answer to. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Men who had crossed him learned that his calm was not the absence of anger, but the architecture of it, controlled and deliberate, the kind of stillness that made grown men reconsider their next sentence before they finished the first one. He wore no watch, no rings, nothing that glittered. The only thing he carried that suggested wealth was a black steel lighter, worn smooth at the edges, that he turned over and bore in his fingers when he was thinking, though no one had ever seen him actually light a cigarette with it. That night in the diner had not been an accident. Damien tested people. It was a habit born from years of being surrounded by men who smiled at his face and counted his money behind his back. He walked into unfamiliar places, dressed as nothing, as no one, just to see who the world was kind to when kindness cost something and bought nothing in return. Elena Marsh had passed a test she never knew she was taking. And now he owned the building she worked in, and he had no intention of letting her disappear back into the anonymous crowd of people who had failed him. She tried to quit that first week. She stood in the newly renovated office that used to be the diner's cramped supply closet and told him, with as much steel in her voice as she could manage, that she didn't want special treatment, and she didn't want to be anyone's charity case in reverse. Damien had listened to the whole thing without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk, his eyes never leaving her face. And when she finished, he said only, "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a job that pays what you're worth, which is considerably more than what you were being paid to be underestimated. She hadn't expected the word underestimated to land the way it did. Like he'd reached inside her and found the one bruise she'd spent years learning to hide. Because that was the truth of her, wasn't it? Elena Marsh, 26 years old, waitressing tables and refilling ketchup bottles, was not who she appeared to be, and she had worked very hard for a very long time to make sure no one ever asked the question that would unravel it. Before the diner, before the small apartment with the leaking faucet, before the name Marsh even, she had been someone else. She had been a forensic accountant for a private firm that audited companies suspected of laundering money through shell corporations, and she had been good at it, frighteningly good, the kind of good that made numbers speak in sentences other people couldn't hear. And then one audit had gone wrong. One client had turned out to be connected to people who did not appreciate being audited, and within 4 months, her mentor was dead, in what the papers called a car accident, and Elena had packed one bag and vanished into a new name and a new life, because staying alive had seemed, at the time, more important than staying herself. She took the job at Voss Maritime as an administrative assistant, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself she would find a way out before anyone looked too closely at her file. She did not yet understand that Damien Voss did not do anything without looking closely first, and that he had already run a background check that dead-ended in a way that told him more than a clean record ever could have. A dead end wasn't nothing. A dead end was a person who had gone to enormous trouble to disappear, and men who disappeared that thoroughly almost always had a reason worth knowing. For the first month, he kept his distance, watching her the way a man watches weather rolling in from a distance he can't yet name, not with alarm, but with the wary attention of someone who has learned that the sky doesn't lie about what's coming. Elena adapted to Voss Maritime faster than she wanted to admit. She was efficient, sharp, unbothered by the tension that made other employees flinch when Damien walked through a room, and it was that unbothered quality more than anything else that began to unsettle him. Everyone around him performed fear or performed loyalty, sometimes both in the same sentence, and Elena did neither. She simply did her work, met his eyes when he spoke to her, and left at 5 o'clock sharp, regardless of how many hours he stayed behind in his glass office, staring at numbers that refused to add up the way they should have. Because something was wrong inside Voss Maritime, and it had been wrong for over a year. Cargo manifests that didn't match shipping weights. Payments to contractors who did not exist at the addresses listed. A pattern so carefully hidden that Damien's own internal auditors had missed it twice. And the third time they'd missed it, the discrepancy had grown large enough that it could no longer be dismissed as clerical error. Someone close to him, someone with access to the deepest layers of the company's finances, was bleeding money out through a wound so precisely placed that it had to be intentional. Damien suspected everyone and trusted no one, which was, he was beginning to realize with a discomfort he didn't enjoy, a lonely way to run an empire. It was Elena who found the first thread, though she didn't mean to. She'd been asked to reorganize an old filing system, a task so far beneath her actual capabilities that she did it half out of boredom, cross-referencing invoice numbers without thinking too hard about what she was looking at, until the numbers started speaking to her in that old, familiar language she'd spent 3 years trying to forget how to hear. A shipment listed as machine parts that weighed, according to its own paperwork, 40% less than machine parts of that volume should weigh. A vendor whose tax filings led to an address that turned out to be a parking garage. She almost said nothing. She told herself, twice, to close the file and mind her own business, because the last time she had noticed a discrepancy like this one, a man she loved like family had ended up wrapped around a guardrail on a highway he had no reason to be driving on. But something about Damien, the particular exhaustion in the way he rubbed his eyes at the end of long nights, the way he never once raised his voice at anyone even when they deserved it, made her put the file on his desk instead of burying it back where she'd found it. He read it standing up, and she watched something shift behind his expression, a controlled, cold recalculation that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a man realizing the floor beneath him was not as solid as he'd believed. "Where did you learn to read a ledger like this?" he asked, not as an accusation, but as a question that had been circling him for weeks and had finally found its landing place. Elena felt the old fear rise in her throat, familiar and suffocating. The fear of being seen too clearly by someone who had the power to either protect her or destroy her, and she genuinely did not know, in that moment, which one Damien Voss would choose to be. She told him the truth, or most of it. She told him about the audits, about the firm, about the mentor who had died, and the name she had buried alongside him. She did not tell him everything. She kept back the name of the man who had ordered the audit that got her mentor killed, because some fears you don't hand to anyone, not even a man whose eyes had started, without her fully noticing, to hold something warmer than suspicion. Damien listened without interrupting, the same way he had that first week in his office, and when she finished, he didn't offer sympathy, which she was grateful for, because sympathy from a man like him would have felt like being handled. Instead, he said, "Then you're the only person in this building I can trust to look at these books and tell me the truth." It should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, something in her chest loosened for the first time in 3 years. What followed was not a romance in the traditional sense, not at first. It was closer to a slow negotiation between two people who had both learned, through hard experience, that trust was the most expensive currency in the world, and the one most likely to get you killed if you spent it carelessly. They worked late together, poring over manifests and wire transfers in his office long after the rest of the building had emptied, and in the particular quiet of those hours, something began to happen that neither of them had planned for, and both of them were too proud to name. Damien would catch himself watching the way she frowned at a column of numbers, the small furrow between her brows when something didn't add up, and he would have to remind himself, with real effort, that he had a company hemorrhaging money and an internal traitor to find, and that neither of those problems would be solved by the increasingly consuming question of what her hair smelled like when she leaned close to point at a discrepancy on his screen. Elena, for her part, began to notice the way his composure cracked in small, almost invisible places when she was near, the way his voice dropped half a register, the way his hand would hover near the small of her back when he guided her through a doorway, and then withdraw, as though he'd caught himself reaching for something he had no right to want. He was, she came to understand, a man who had built an entire empire on the principle of never needing anyone, and she was slowly, without either of their permission, becoming the first exception to that rule in his adult life. It frightened him more than any rival, any threat, any enemy he'd ever faced in the shipping lanes, or the boardrooms, or the quiet, brutal negotiations that had built Voss Maritime into what it was. Enemies he knew how to handle. He did not know how to handle the particular vulnerability of wanting someone to stay. The trail Elena had uncovered led, with the patient inevitability of a noose tightening, toward Marcus Reyes, Damien's second-in-command, the man who had stood beside him for 11 years, who had been at his side during the early years when Voss Maritime was 2 ships and a warehouse, and a dream that most people had told Damien was reckless. Marcus had helped build the empire. Marcus had also, Elena's numbers suggested with a precision that left no comfortable room for doubt, been quietly siphoning it apart for the better part of 18 months, funneling money through shell vendors into accounts that eventually, after enough careful laundering, fed into a rival shipping consortium that had been trying to swallow Voss Maritime's territory for years. Damien did not want to believe it. Elena watched him read the final report 3 times, watched the muscle in his jaw work as he searched for an alternate explanation that the numbers simply refused to offer him. 11 years, he said quietly, and it was the first time she had heard something in his voice that sounded almost like grief. I trusted him with things I never told anyone else. Elena didn't offer comfort she didn't have. She understood, better than most people could, exactly what it cost to have your trust weaponized by someone who had spent years earning it, specifically so they could spend it. But betrayal, once uncovered, rarely stays contained to the page. Marcus had not survived 11 years at Damien's side by being careless, and when he noticed the pattern of Elena's late nights in Damien's office, when he noticed the particular way Damien's attention had begun orbiting a woman who was supposed to be nothing more than an administrative assistant, he understood, with the cold clarity of a man watching his own downfall assemble itself, exactly what she had found, and exactly what it would cost him. He did not confront Damien. He went instead after Elena. It happened on a Tuesday night, ordinary in every way until it wasn't. Elena was leaving the office later than usual, the parking garage half empty and echoing with the particular hollow sound of footsteps that don't belong to you. Marcus was waiting by her car, and for the first time since she'd started at Voss Maritime, she saw the version of him that had spent 1.5 years stealing from a man who called him brother, not charming, not warm, but flat and calculating in a way that made her skin go cold before he said a single word. You should have minded your own business, he told her, and the diner waitress persona she'd worn for 3 years fell away from her all at once, replaced by something older and harder that she had buried but never actually lost. Marcus had underestimated her twice. Once as a woman no one in the building thought twice about, and once as someone who would simply freeze the way most people froze when a man twice their size stepped into their path with violence in his eyes. He did not know about the self-defense training that had come standard, with 3 years of auditing men who occasionally sent people to make audits stop, and by the time backup arrived, Damien, who had noticed her car still in the garage on the security feed and felt something close to panic for the first time in a decade. Marcus was on the ground with a broken wrist, and Elna was standing over him, breathing hard, her hands steady in a way that told Damien everything he needed to know about how thoroughly he had underestimated the woman he'd hired to organize old files. What Damien felt, watching her in that garage, the controlled fury, the competence, the way she had protected herself without needing him to arrive in time, was not relief exactly, though relief was there too, buried under something far more disorienting. It was the recognition that the woman standing in front of him was not someone who needed his protection so much as someone who deserved his partnership, and the distinction mattered to him in a way he hadn't expected it to. He had spent his whole adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Elena had never once asked him for anything, not money, not power, not even safety. She had simply, quietly, given him the truth, and then defended herself when the truth turned dangerous, and there was nothing in his considerable experience that had prepared him for how much that meant. Marcus's arrest unraveled quickly after that, though not without one final, desperate move, a call he made from the back of a police car to associates in the rival consortium, warning them that the deal was compromised and offering, in exchange for their protection, the one piece of leverage he had left, Elena's real name, and the audit firm she'd fled, and the men who had killed her mentor and would very much like to know where she'd been hiding for 3 years. It was a small, vicious act, the last card of a man with nothing left to lose, and it should have terrified her more than anything else that had happened that week. Instead, when Damien told her what Marcus had done, sitting across from her in his office with the city lights spread out behind him like a field of cold stars, she felt something unexpected settle in her chest. She was tired of hiding. She had been tired of it for 3 years, and she hadn't let herself admit it until right now, with a man who had already seen the worst and most dangerous truth about her, and had not won so on. "I can protect you," Damien said, and it wasn't a boast. It was simply a fact, stated the way he stated all facts, flat and certain. "I have resources those men have never had to plan around. But I need you to understand something first, because I won't lie to you the way everyone else in your life apparently has. If you stay, I'm not going to be able to keep pretending this is only about the company's books." Elena had spent 3 years learning to read the smallest tells of dangerous men, and she read, in the tight set of his jaw and the uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice, the truth of what it cost him to say something that honest out loud. "I don't want you to protect me because you feel responsible for me," she said quietly. "I want to know if you'd still be standing here if I couldn't hand you a spreadsheet that saves your company." The question hung in the air between them, dangerous in a way neither of them had expected honesty to be. Damien crossed the room and did not touch her. Not yet, though everything in the way he moved suggested a man exercising enormous, deliberate restraint. "I watched you across a garage tonight take down a man twice your size without waiting for anyone to save you," he said. "I have known for weeks that I would have come to your defense, whether you needed saving or not, because the thought of anything happening to you had already stopped being about the company before you ever found that first invoice." It was, for a man who measured every word he spoke like currency, as close to a confession as he had ever made to another living person, and Elena felt the last of her carefully constructed distance crack open. There was a night, before any of that danger arrived, that Elena would return to in her memory long after everything else had settled. An ordinary night that somehow became the hinge on which the rest of her life turned. Damien had asked her to stay late, not for the ledgers this time, but because a shipment was coming in from overseas, and he wanted, for reasons he didn't fully explain even to himself, for her to be there when it did. They stood together on the observation deck above the loading docks, the cold air off the water sharp enough to sting, and for a long time, neither of them said anything at all. It was Damien who finally broke the silence, and what he said surprised them both. "My father built this company out of nothing," he said, watching the cranes lower containers onto waiting trucks with the same mechanical patience they'd had for decades. "He used to tell me that a man who lets anyone get close enough to matter is a man handing out the blueprint to his own destruction. I believed him for a long time. I built my whole life around not being that kind of fool." Elena said nothing, only listened, because she understood instinctively that this was not a conversation that wanted to be interrupted. "Then you set a dollar bill on a counter for a stranger who couldn't pay for his coffee," he continued, "and didn't ask for anything back. I've spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what to do with that, because nothing in the way I was raised gave me a framework for it." Elena turned to look at him then, really look, past the tailored coat and the careful stillness and the reputation that preceded him into every room he entered, and she saw, for the first time, the boy his father had shaped into a fortress long before he'd had any say in the matter. "Maybe," she said quietly, "the blueprint isn't a weakness. Maybe it's just what lets 2 people build something neither of them could build alone." He didn't answer her that night, not in words, but he stood beside her at the railing until the last truck pulled away from the docks, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers, and neither of them moved away. It was after that night that the small changes started, the ones so subtle that Elena almost missed them entirely. Damien began asking her opinion on decisions that had nothing to do with the missing money, a proposed contract, a difficult personnel choice, the wording of a statement to the board, not because he needed her expertise in those areas, but because he had apparently decided, somewhere in the quiet architecture of his own mind, that he valued the way she thought. He started remembering small things she'd mentioned only once, the coffee order she preferred when the nights ran long, the fact that she hated the particular fluorescent hum of the fourth-floor conference room, and without any announcement, meetings that used to happen there began happening somewhere else instead. He was not, Elena realized, with something between amusement and a slow, unraveling tenderness, a man who knew how to say the things he felt. He was a man who rebuilt the small architecture of the world around a person instead, brick by careful brick, the same patient way he'd built everything else that mattered to him. It should have felt like too much. Instead, it felt like being seen by someone who had made a study of her without ever once making her feel like a subject. It was also during those weeks that Elena caught herself, more than once, wanting to warn him and holding back, weighing how much to tell a man who held so much power over her future against how much she still needed, after 3 years of practiced silence, to protect the last private corners of herself. She had not told him everything about the men who had killed her mentor, not their names, not the full shape of what they'd been hiding, not the specific fear that still woke her, some nights certain she'd heard footsteps outside a window that had nothing outside it at all. Damien never pushed. He seemed to understand, in the particular way of a man who had also spent a lifetime deciding exactly how much of himself was safe to hand to another person, that trust built slowly held better than trust extracted all at once, and that pressing her would only teach her that his patience had limits after all. That restraint, more than any grand declaration, was what finally convinced her that whatever this was between them, it was not going to collapse the moment she was fully known. The men who came for her, 3 of them, sent quietly by the audit firm's original enemies, arriving under the cover of a supposed delivery 2 nights later, walked into a trap that Damien and Elena had built together, her knowledge of financial systems combined with his knowledge of the more physical machinery of protection and consequence. It was not a clean story, and Elena would later admit that some part of her had wanted, quietly and without shame, to be the one standing there when the men who had ordered her mentor's death finally faced consequences, instead of disappearing back into whatever shadow they'd crawled out of. She got that chance. The confrontation was tense, fast, and over before it had properly begun. Damien's people moving with the precision of men who had done this before, and Elena herself refusing, despite every protective instinct Damien had, to be kept somewhere safe and out of the way while it happened. She stood beside him, not behind him, and when it was finished, when the men responsible for 3 years of her fear were finally the ones facing consequences, instead of hiding from them, she felt something inside her unlock that she hadn't realized had been sealed shut since the night her mentor died. The weeks that followed were quieter, and quiet, Elena discovered, suited Damien Voss far better than the version of him the world usually saw. Voss Maritime stabilized. Marcus faced trial, his testimony implicating enough of the rival consortium's leadership that the threat to both Elena's old life and Damien's company collapsed under its own weight within a season. Damien gave her a title that reflected what she actually was, not an assistant, but the head of an internal financial security division that answered to no one but him. And if the board members who had once dismissed the waitress from the takeover found that hard to swallow, none of them said so twice. What mattered more than the title, though, was smaller and quieter, than anything that made it into a company memo. It was the way Damien had started leaving his office door open when she was in the building, an old habit of control softening into something that looked, to anyone paying attention, remarkably like trust. It was the way Elena, for the first time in 3 years, gave someone her real name and did not flinch when he used it. It was the black steel lighter, he finally explained one evening, turning it over in his hands the way he always did. It had belonged to his father, the only inheritance from a man who had taught him that showing weakness got you killed, and he had carried it for 15 years as a reminder never to need anyone, the way his father had needed the people who eventually destroyed him. He gave it to her without a speech, without ceremony, simply set it in her palm and closed her fingers around it, and Elena understood, without needing him to say another word, exactly what he was telling her. He was choosing, deliberately and with open eyes, to need someone after all. If you were captivated by Elena's hidden strength and Damien's dark, guarded obsession, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Elena's shoes? Walk away from a man like Damien Voss, or stay and find out what was underneath the danger? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss